When American landing ships approached Iwo Jima, no one had any doubts. The fighting would be fierce. But the main threat was not only hidden in the underground tunnels of the Japanese garrison. By this time, a phenomenon had emerged in the air that American sailors simply called the suicide planes, kamikaze aircraft. This was not an accident or a gesture of despair by a single pilot. It was official doctrine. Japan understood that its air force was depleted, its experienced pilots lost, and the American fleet was overwhelming in numbers and technology. There remained one method that required a minimum of fuel and training but caused maximum damage: to send the plane straight into the ship. Why did Iwo Jima become the point where the kamikaze attacks intensified? There are several reasons, each of which is critical. 1. Geography. Iwo Jima was located on the route of American B-29 bombers flying to Japan. Capturing the island would give the U.S. an airfield for refueling and emergency landings. This was unacceptable to the Japanese command. 2. Loss of air superiority. By early 1945, Japan had almost lost control of the skies over its own islands. Kamikaze attacks were an attempt to compensate for this disaster with a cheap but devastating blow. Third strike on the fleet. To land on Iwo Jima, the U.S. concentrated large naval forces, battleships, aircraft carriers, transports, and destroyers. For the kamikaze, it was the perfect set of targets. Lots of ships, active air defense, constant maneuvers. It was here that Japanese commanders hoped to deliver the most painful blow. But the most important thing was the psychological aspect. For the first time, the Americans were faced not just with an enemy who was going all the way, but with one who was already dead when the battle began. The pilots did not fly to win, but with the task of dying in such a way that their deaths would cost the U.S. as much as possible. That is why the battles around Iwo Jima became one of the most dangerous episodes of the confrontation with the kamikaze. And what happened next was not just aircraft attacks. It was a clash of two strategies, two worldviews, and two armies that the war had already pushed to the limit. 1. Airfields on Iwo Jima itself. There were 3 of them: Hatagaya, Motoyama, number 1, and Motoyama number 2. This is a well-known fact. They were built as rear bases, but by 1945 they had become forward bases. Their tasks were to receive fighter planes for intercepting B-29s, to support the garrison, including launching a limited number of aircraft for attacks on the fleet. The problem for the Japanese was simple. American bombing raids put these airfields out of action almost daily. Their operational capacity declined with each passing day. 2. Airfields on neighboring islands, main kamikaze base. The main kamikaze groups for attacks on Iwo Jima did not take off from Iwo Jima itself, but from more distant airfields on other islands, Chichijima, Hahajima. These islands are specifically mentioned in sources as key bases for Japanese aviation in the region. Why from there? There were fewer American raids there. The runways were longer and better maintained. It was possible to station more aircraft and repair crews there. It was these airfields that provided more frequent sorties. 3. The state of Japanese aviation. The key to understanding the attacks? It is important not to romanticize here. By early 1945, Japan was experiencing an acute shortage of almost everything. Facts: a shortage of trained pilots, minimal fuel reserves, worn-out aircraft, deteriorating ammunition quality. Therefore, kamikaze attacks were not a tactic of choice, but a necessary measure. Any aircraft were used, from old Zeros to training models. The main thing was that they could take off and reach their target. 4. What a real kamikaze launch looked like. A typical process, based on historical descriptions. The engine was warmed up using minimal fuel. The pilot received brief instructions and coordinates. The aircraft was not equipped with any extra cargo. only explosives. The takeoff often takes place at too low an altitude to avoid radar detection. Some of the planes did not even reach the combat zone due to breakdowns. In other words, the system was simple, but as pragmatic as possible. 5. Why was it so difficult for the Americans to predict where the attack would come from? Air defense problems. Low-flying aircraft disappeared from radar. Kamikaze planes could take off at different times and from different islands. The Japanese sometimes launched decoy aircraft to distract fighters. This made the air situation chaotic and the threat unpredictable. When the landing on Iwo Jima began, American Marines expected heavy fighting on the shore. They knew about the Japanese underground tunnels and prepared firing points. But what they were not fully prepared for were the first waves of kamikaze attacks, aimed primarily at the fleet supporting the operation from the sea. Why the first attacks began immediately? The Japanese command understood that it would be difficult to hold the island using conventional methods. Iwo Jima was a small piece of land, but strategically important. Control of it gave the U.S. a springboard for raids on Japan. Therefore, the Japanese decided to use kamikaze as a tool of maximum pressure, to disrupt supplies, destroy support ships, and thwart the landing. In the early days of the operation, individual groups of kamikaze pilots were ordered to target aircraft carriers, destroyers, and fire support ships. First visual contacts. For the soldiers on the shore, it looked like this. Above them, the roar of engines, several dots on the horizon, and only after a few seconds did it become clear that these were not ordinary reconnaissance planes. The pilots flew low, fast, with almost no maneuvers. Their task was simple: to strike. The fleet's response destroyers and cruisers formed a defensive ring. The ships fired a barrage of tracer shells. In daylight conditions, pilots were often shot down before they could get close. But a few planes still managed to break through. American radio intercepts had already warned of the threat, but seeing it with their own eyes was another matter. In the first hours of the landing, the Marines heard explosions coming from the sea. It was the ship's anti-aircraft guns opening fire on the approaching aircraft. The first successful strike was against one of the escort destroyers. The aircraft, which had been hit dozens of times, still managed to crash into the superstructure. This was the moment when the Americans on shore and on ships finally realized that kamikaze attacks were not an isolated incident, but a systematic tactic. Psychological effect. For soldiers who had just begun to advance deeper into the island, the first successful kamikaze attacks were an additional source of stress. On the one hand, they needed to break through the Japanese fortifications. On the other hand, they understood that the fleet behind them, providing support and evacuation, was under constant threat. There was a feeling that there was no safe rear. Even powerful ships that seemed unsinkable could be put out of action by a single aircraft. The outcome of the first clashes. The first days of the operation showed that kamikaze attacks were a real threat, not a propaganda myth. The fleet had to constantly change positions, strengthen air defense, and coordinate the work of radars and anti-aircraft crews. For the Marines, it was a reminder that the battle for Iwo Jima was not only about firing points and tunnels on the ground, but also about an enemy willing to die in the sky to inflict maximum damage. When the Americans faced the first kamikaze attacks, it became clear that these were not chaotic suicide raids, but a structured system. Japanese pilots acted according to specific tactics, practiced maneuvers, and underwent special training, albeit accelerated due to a lack of time and resources. Pilot training before combat. In reality, most kamikaze pilots were not aviation aces. They were young pilots, often with minimal flight hours. However, they were trained in two areas: attack accuracy. They were taught which parts of the ship to target: the bridge area, aircraft carrier hangars, areas with large amounts of fuel or ammunition, direct attack without retreat. The main thing was to stay on course even under fire. Most of the training consisted of takeoffs, flying in a straight line, and simulated diving. Many pilots wrote their last letters home and held short ceremonies. This was a difficult psychological element that Japan used to strengthen their resolve. Aircraft types and equipment. Various models were used for the attacks, but most often they were outdated fighters and training aircraft that could no longer compete in conventional air combat. Additional explosives were attached to the aircraft, sometimes a bomb under the fuselage, sometimes the aircraft itself was turned into a flying bomb. This was a pragmatic decision by the command. Even an old aircraft could cause enormous damage if it was directed precisely at a ship. Combat formations and methods of approaching the target. The pilots did not fly chaotically. Several tactics were used. Wave attacks. Several groups approached in succession to overload the anti-aircraft defenses. Approach from the clouds or from the side of the sun. This reduced the chance of being detected by radar and visual observers. Descent to minimum altitude. This way they tried to bypass radar and reduce the reaction time of ships, diving in the last seconds. This made it difficult for anti-aircraft guns to lock on. Risks and weaknesses of Japanese tactics. Although kamikaze pilots were considered an unpredictable threat, their tactics had vulnerabilities. The planes were slow and easily vulnerable to U.S. radar. They were often shot down long before reaching their target. A shortage of experienced pilots reduced accuracy. Nevertheless, a single successful strike could completely disable a ship, so the threat had to be taken seriously. How it looked from the American side, observers on the ships described a similar picture. A small dot on the horizon, then a rapid trajectory straight towards the ship, then a bright flash from tracers, and only occasionally did the aircraft break through the fire. For the crews, it was non-stop tension. Any mistake in calculating the fire could result in a fatal strike. When the operation to capture Iwo Jima began in February 1945, the American-Japanese confrontation in the air reached a new level. The U.S. Navy concentrated large forces near the island. Aircraft carriers, battleships, cruisers, and dozens of destroyers. It was an ideal target for Japanese commanders looking for a way to inflict maximum damage with minimum resources. It was during these days that the first major kamikaze attacks on ships supporting the operation took place. How the attacks began. The attacks rarely came as a surprise. American radars detected the approaching aircraft in advance. But the problem was that the Japanese often used mixed groups. Regular pilots and kamikaze pilots flew together to confuse the defenses. As a result, the Americans had to respond to all of them at once. In the early days of the operation, small but highly determined groups of Japanese aircraft began to approach the U.S. fleet. Some pilots tried to disguise their tactics as normal air combat. They climbed to a high altitude, pretended to turn around, and then dove sharply toward the ship. The first successes of the Japanese. It is historically confirmed that several ships were damaged in the first days of the assault. Destroyers were most often targeted. They were closer to the shore, provided fire support, and were less protected than larger ships. A typical scenario looked like this. A Japanese plane broke through the echelons of fighters and anti-aircraft guns, descended to a dangerously low altitude, made a final dash toward the ship. Even if the aircraft was shot down in the last seconds, it often continued to glide by inertia and could still crash into the hull. Reaction of American crews. The ship's crews quickly realized that a kamikaze attack was not a normal air raid. There was no maneuvering battle or enemy retreat. The plane moved toward the ship until the very last moment. American crews described it this way: "You can see that he's not going to turn. He's coming straight at us. Either we shoot him down or he hits us." For sailors, it was a constant source of nervous tension. Even a short air raid signal meant that it was impossible to know in advance whether it was a regular reconnaissance aircraft or a pilot who had already decided to die. Why attacks were particularly dangerous here? The main reason was the density of the fleet. When more than 100 ships are operating in a small area, an attacking aircraft will almost always find its target. The huge amount of equipment meant that the probability of missing a target was reduced. The Americans had to defend themselves in different sectors at the same time. Every delay could cost a ship. In addition, the Japanese still held several airfields near Iwo Jima, from which they could launch kamikaze attacks over short distances, making interception more difficult. Summary of the first days. Despite powerful air defenses, the U.S. fleet still suffered damage. Some ships had to be temporarily taken out of service, crews suffered casualties, and tension in the ranks only grew. The Americans realized that the kamikaze attacks were not accidental or isolated incidents. This was the new reality of the battle for Iwo Jima. The first kamikaze attacks came as a shock, but not a surprise. Intelligence had already warned the U.S. command that Japan was increasingly using suicide aircraft tactics. But it was only when they encountered them at Iwo Jima that the Americans realized the scale of the threat. Their defenses began to change literally in the course of the battle. Reinforcement of air patrols. The first decision was to increase the number of fighter planes on interception duty. Aircraft carriers sent additional patrol groups into the air, creating a dense umbrella of F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs. In this way, the Americans tried to shoot down the kamikaze as far away from the ships as possible. But the problem was that the kamikaze flew low and fast. Sometimes they were only spotted when they were already entering the destroyer's firing zone. Adjusting radar operation. Radars began to be reconfigured for the task of detecting low-flying targets. Previously, attention had been focused on high-altitude raids and enemy fighters. Now, operators were looking for small blips in the lower sector. This required experience and nerves of steel. The slightest mistake could cost a ship. Rearrangement of ship formations. The Americans changed the layout of ships around the island. Destroyers and smaller vessels were brought forward as an air defense shield. Large ships, aircraft carriers, and battleships were kept behind, increasing the distance to the shore. Cruisers occupied an intermediate position, strengthening the fire perimeter. The purpose of this rearrangement was to create several lines of defense. First fighters, then destroyers, and only then large ships. Improving anti-aircraft fire. The crews were instructed to fire not at the aircraft, but in front of it, creating a cloud of shells. The following weapons were used: Bofor's 40mm rapid-fire guns, Oerlikon 20mm cannons, heavy guns with radio fuses. Radio fuses proved to be particularly effective. Shells that detonated when approaching the target, even if they did not hit it. Transition to round-the-clock duty. After several successful kamikaze attacks, the command realized that danger could arise at any time. Ships went on Combat Readiness Number 1 at the slightest suspicion. Observers worked in sectors without interruption. Radars were not turned off for a minute. Anti-aircraft crews slept right next to their guns. This system was exhausting but necessary, growing experience and reducing losses. By the middle of the operation, it became clear that the Americans had adapted. They began to shoot down more attacking aircraft before they even reached the fleet. Crews learned to distinguish between normal raids and ramming attempts. Reactions became faster and coordination became clearer. But even with reinforced defenses and new tactics, it was impossible to completely stop the kamikaze. There was always at least one aircraft that broke through the fire. And each such attempt served as a reminder. These were not just air attacks, but an enemy that had no intention of turning back. Despite reinforced defenses, dense air patrols, and rearranged ship formations, It was impossible to completely protect the fleet from kamikaze attacks. Sooner or later, there were moments when a single aircraft managed to break through the outer echelons of defense and get right on course for attack. It was these episodes that became the most dangerous and tense for American crews. What the breakthrough looked like in reality. A typical scenario: a group of Japanese aircraft distracts attention in one direction. Several targets appear on the radar, U.S. fighters rush to intercept, anti-aircraft guns start firing. At the same moment, a lone aircraft appears low over the water. Sometimes it is a small Yokosuka K-5Y trainer. Sometimes it is an old Zero fighter. The pilot stays at minimum altitude, using the ripples of the waves as cover. He is almost invisible until the last minute. This is a breakthrough, when an aircraft gets so close to the ships that the anti-aircraft gunners have only a few seconds to react. Why some planes still broke through? There were several reasons. Low altitude made radars less effective. Slow speeds paradoxically helped pilots. Shells often overshot their targets. A unidirectional course. The pilot did not maneuver, which allowed him to save energy for the final dive. The element of surprise. The Japanese often used diversionary groups. American sailors often said, "We could shoot down dozens, but one always found its way through." The final seconds before impact. If the aircraft passed through the destroyer's long-range fire zone, close combat began. Rapid-fire machine guns worked continuously. Tracers formed an almost continuous line. But even if the aircraft caught fire, it did not mean that the danger had passed. A burning kamikaze could still maintain its course. Many strikes happened just like that. The plane fell but continued to glide by inertia toward the ship. Typical targets of Japanese pilots' kamikaze were not chosen at random. The priority was as follows. Aircraft carriers were the main target, but they were rarely reached due to their strong defenses. Destroyers were closer, less protected, and often fired at the coast. Cruisers and transports were targeted depending on the situation. Destroyers suffered particularly often at Iwo Jima. They were closer to the coast, supported the landing forces, and took the brunt of the first waves of aircraft. Examples of damage: generalized, without imagination. It is historically known that several U.S. ships were damaged by kamikaze attacks during the Battle for Iwo Jima. The scenario was similar in each case. The aircraft breaks through the last line of air defense. The strike hits the superstructure, deck or torpedo tube area. Fuel flash plus explosion of the aircraft's ammunition. Fire spreads across the upper deck. Even a small aircraft weighing 1 ton and carrying 200 to 250 kilograms of explosives could cause enough damage to put the ship out of action. Psychological effect on American crews. Each such breakthrough was a blow not only to the metal, but also to the morale of the people on board. The sailors understood. If you see a kamikaze hundreds of meters away, it means that it has already passed through dozens of barriers, and now everything depends on your split-second reaction. After each strike, the crews became more attentive, but also more tense. It was a war where even a single aircraft could change the course of the battle locally. While the kamikaze pilots were trying to break through to the ships at Iwo Jima, another equally important battle was taking place in the sky. American fighter planes were not just escorting the fleet, they were the first line of defense, determining whether Japanese planes would even reach the ships. And it was often the actions of the interceptors that decided the outcome of the day. Why air cover was critically important? The main idea was simple. It was better to shoot down kamikaze planes tens of kilometers away than in the last seconds before they reached the ship. American aircraft carriers provided round-the-clock sorties. Several echelons of air control were created over the fleet. Long-range patrol intercepted groups of Japanese aircraft before they approached. Middle circle finished off those who broke through. Close circle, reserve, ready to take off in case of an emergency threat. As soon as targets appeared on the radar, the aircraft carrier sent a pair or a squadron of fighters to intercept them. Which aircraft were involved in the battle? The corps was made up of F-6F Hellcat, the fleet's main fighter, reliable, fast, and easy to fly. F-4 U Corsair, faster and more powerful, effective in diving. FM-2 Wildcat, older but still used on small aircraft carriers. These aircraft surpassed Japanese machines in speed and altitude. But the problem was different. Kamikaze pilots did not try to engage in aerial combat. They did not maneuver or engage in duels. They flew straight towards the fleet, ignoring the threat. This made interception difficult. Pilots had to shoot them down quickly before they had time to descend. Typical air battles. The interception looked like this. American fighters approached from above. They opened fire on Japanese aircraft while they were flying in a straight line. If the target descended, the U.S. planes would dive, trying to shoot it down before it entered the radar blind spot. Sometimes the kamikaze flew so low that the fighters had to climb after the attack, almost to the point of colliding with the waves. Why not all attacks could be stopped? Despite the effectiveness of the interceptors, there were factors that gave the Japanese a chance. The short distance between the airfields of Japan and Iwo Jima, attacks by small groups, which were difficult to spot in time, flights in clouds and under the cover of haze, false groups that distracted interceptors from the real threat. American pilots admitted, "We could control the sky most of the time, but no one could guarantee a 100% interception." The contribution of interceptors to the defense of the fleet. Although the kamikaze carried out attacks, the role of the U.S. Air Force was decisive. It was the interceptors that destroyed most Japanese aircraft before they reached the ships, reduced the intensity of the attacks, gave the fleet time and opportunity to rebuild its defenses. Without fighters, the fleet at Iwo Jima would have been in a much more vulnerable position. It was air cover that made it possible for ships to remain near the island for a long time and provided support for amphibious operations. After the fall of Iwo Jima, the U.S. command finally gained access to most of the Japanese field headquarters. In the captured premises, they found what American intelligence had only guessed at: detailed logs of kamikaze sorties, lists of volunteers, and internal reports that painted a completely different picture of what was happening. The myth of total voluntariness collapsed. The documents showed that some of the pilots did indeed go out of conviction, but many more were on the lists after individual conversations with their commanders. Formally, they were volunteers. In reality, they had almost no choice. The reports contained phrases such as, "The pilot expressed doubts, educational work was carried out. Assigned to a special mission, consent obtained." In other words, consent was often obtained after the assignment had already been made. It turned out that the effectiveness was lower than Japan had believed. The actual number of hits was lower than officially announced. Many planes crashed into the sea, did not reach their destination, lost their target, or were shot down by anti-aircraft guns. According to Japanese reports, 70 to 80% of hits. According to U.S. data, less than 20%. This gap was critical. The Japanese fleet headquarters painted a picture that kamikaze pilots could turn the tide of the war. The reality was not so. The letters that were discovered changed perceptions of the war. Americans found hundreds of undelivered letters from kamikaze pilots. Most importantly, most of them did not contain fanaticism. They contained requests to tell their families that everything would not be in vain, hope that the war would end quickly, fear of dying senselessly, wishes for others to live. This broke the stereotype. Kamikaze pilots were not death machines, but ordinary young people who had been drawn into the system. The main conclusion that shocked American analysts noted in their post-war reports: the Japanese command knew perfectly well that the kamikaze strategy would not change the outcome of the war, but it continued it in order to delay surrender and gain time for negotiations. In other words, people were sent on suicide missions, knowing that it would not save Japan. The goal was to prolong the war at any cost. Why this is closely related to Iwo Jima? It was during the battles for Iwo Jima that it became clear. Japan was ready to hold out to the last. The command was ready to sacrifice thousands to gain weeks. Kamikaze had become an instrument of despair, not strategy. For the U.S., this was a warning. Okinawa would be even worse, and the landing on Honshu would be a disaster. Therefore, some American generals began to speak openly about the need for an alternative to invasion, and this became one of the factors that would later lead to the decision to use nuclear weapons. After Iwo Jima and the subsequent battles in Okinawa, the kamikaze strategy lost its strategic value, but left a powerful mark on history. The fighting spirit, sacrifices, and myth of heroism became part of Japanese military culture. But for the world, it was a terrible lesson in how ideology and despair can turn young people into instruments of death, numbers, and losses. Several hundred kamikaze missions were carried out on Iwo Jima. The pilots themselves lost about 1,200 to 1,500 people. American losses from kamikaze attacks amounted to about 4,900 killed and 4,800 wounded. The statistics show that this was a high price to pay for a tactical effect that turned out to be minimal. Psychological effect. Despite their limited strategic success, the kamikaze missions exerted enormous psychological pressure. American soldiers and commanders spoke of feeling anxious at the sight of every plane, even if it did not ultimately reach its target. For the Japanese, it was a symbol of loyalty and willingness to sacrifice oneself, myth and reality. After the war, Japan began to create a myth about the sacred heroism of the kamikaze, while internal documents showed that not all volunteers were completely free to choose. Effectiveness was lower than claimed. Motivation was often a mixture of patriotism and pressure from the command. This contrast between myth and reality has been the subject of historical research, films, and documentaries. Cultural legacy, Iwo Jima became a symbol of both courage and tragedy. Americans immortalized it through memorials and films, while the Japanese did so through museums and monuments. Overall, the story of the kamikaze is not just a military episode, but a lesson about the value of human life and the limits of ideology. Conclusion and thoughts for the viewer. The story of the kamikaze on Iwo Jima shows that even in conditions of despair and fanaticism, reality often destroys the legend. Behind the myth of heroism are thousands of young people with hopes, fears, and families. And that is what makes their story both frightening and important for understanding war.